poor farmer found a hidden tunnel in his barn. 80 years later, police made a chilling discovery. When the barn floor gave way beneath his feet that winter morning, the farmer never imagined he was about to uncover a secret that had been buried for over 70 years. A secret that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his family, and connect him to a conspiracy of silence that stretched across 5 states. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. The frost had settled thick across the fields that February morning, the kind of cold that makes the earth crack and splinter beneath your boots. Inside the old barn, the air smelled of decades-old hay and motor oil, mixed with that particular scent of wood that's been standing for generations, dry, dusty, touched with the faint sweetness of decay. The farmer, a third-generation landowner whose weathered hands told the story of 63 years on this land, was alone. He was always alone these days. His daughter had left years ago after a fight neither of them could quite remember the details of anymore. Just anger, pride, and words that couldn't be taken back. Now the bills piled higher than the crops yielded, and the bank's letters came with increasing frequency, each one a countdown he tried not to think about. The mortgage was 3 months overdue. The equipment needed repairs he couldn't afford. And winter meant no income, just expenses that ate away at what little he had left. He'd been reinforcing a weak spot in the floor, that particular board near the southeast corner that had creaked for as long as he could remember. His grandfather had probably walked over that same board 1,000 times. The hammer felt heavy in his grip as he pried up the old wood, splinters catching in the morning light that filtered through the gaps in the barn walls. The wood was older than it should be, darker, treated with something that had preserved it far beyond its natural life. Then the board didn't just come up. It gave way entirely. The sound echoed through the empty barn. Not just wood breaking, but something hollow beneath, something that shouldn't be there. The farmer stumbled back, his heart suddenly pounding as he stared down into the darkness that had opened beneath what should have been solid ground. His first thought was foundation damage, something that would cost thousands to repair, another expense he couldn't handle. But as the dust settled and his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made no sense. Stone steps descended into absolute blackness, hand-carved, deliberate, old. The edges of the opening were sealed with concrete that had been poured decades ago, the kind of work that spoke of permanence and intention. His grandfather had sealed this. Had to be. The way the floorboards had been so deliberately placed. This wasn't hidden by accident. This was buried on purpose. Someone had wanted this entrance to disappear, to be forgotten, to remain sealed until the wood itself gave way from age. The farmer's breath came faster now, fog in the cold barn air. Every instinct told him to call someone, to get help. But who? The daughter who hadn't spoken to him in years, except through lawyers about selling the farm? The neighbors he'd pushed away with his stubborn pride, refusing their offers of help until they stopped offering? The authorities who might take whatever this was, might take everything, might use it as an excuse to condemn the property he'd spent his life trying to keep? His hands trembled as he reached for his flashlight, the yellow beam cutting through the darkness below. The stone steps were smooth, worn in the centers as if from years of use. Decades of footsteps had polished them to a shine that even time couldn't completely erase. How many feet had walked these stairs? When? And why had his grandfather, a man he'd been told was simple, honest, just a farmer like himself, why had that man built a staircase into the earth and then sealed it away as if it had never existed? But what really happened down there? And why had it been hidden for so long? The farmer stood at the edge of that darkness, the cold seeping up from below, carrying with it the scent of stone and stale air and secrets that had waited decades to be found. He took the first step down, and everything he thought he knew about his family began to crumble. Just like that barn floor, revealing something far bigger, far stranger, and far more dangerous than he could have possibly imagined. The stairs seemed to go down forever. Each step the farmer took sent small clouds of dust rising in his flashlight beam, particles that hadn't been disturbed in decades, dancing like ghosts in the yellow light. The temperature dropped with each foot of descent, 10 degrees, 15, 20, until he could see his breath in thick clouds. The walls were stone, hand-chiseled, the marks of tools still visible in the rock face. This wasn't some natural cave or simple root cellar. This was engineering. This was intentional. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 50 steps down, the farmer's legs began to shake, though whether from exertion or fear, he couldn't tell. The smell changed as he descended. Less dust, more earth, and something else. Something organic and old, like the inside of a library that hadn't been opened in generations. Paper, fabric, leather. Time itself seemed to have a smell down here, a scent of preservation and careful storage that spoke of purpose and planning. At step 73, he stopped counting. His mind was reeling with questions that had no answers. How had his grandfather done this? When? The physical labor alone would have taken years, maybe decades. Moving the stone, carving the steps, reinforcing the walls. This wasn't a project one man could complete alone, not without help, not without money and resources his family supposedly never had. And more importantly, why? What could possibly be worth this kind of effort, this kind of secrecy? The tunnel at the bottom stretched ahead into darkness, his flashlight beam swallowed by the black. The farmer's footsteps echoed differently now, a hollow sound that suggested open space. The passage was tall enough for him to stand upright, wide enough for two people to walk side by side. The floor was smooth, worn by passage, and along the walls at regular intervals were brackets that might have once held torches or lanterns. He could see soot marks on the ceiling where flames had burned, evidence that people had walked this tunnel regularly, had lit their way through this underground passage for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. He walked slowly, one hand trailing along the cold stone wall, the other gripping his flashlight like a lifeline. The tunnel curved slightly, engineered to follow the natural contours of the land above. His grandfather's face came to him then, not as he remembered it from faded photographs, but as he'd always imagined it. Stern, silent. A man who kept his counsel and expected others to do the same. A man who never explained, never justified, never shared more than was absolutely necessary. Had he walked this tunnel? Had he built it with his own hands? 187 feet from the stairs, the farmer's flashlight beam hit something that made him stop dead. A door, not wood, but metal, thick, heavy, industrial. The kind of door you'd see on a bank vault, not buried beneath a barn in rural farmland. It was sealed tight, a massive lock mechanism at its center, but no visible keyhole. Just a series of numbers embossed in the metal, arranged in a pattern he didn't understand. Concentric circles with rotating discs, each marked with symbols that looked like a combination of numbers and letters. His hands found something else then, wedged into a gap in the stone beside the door. A book. Leather-bound, swollen with age and moisture, but still intact. He pulled it free carefully, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The leather was soft with age, darkened to almost black, the pages brittle and yellowed. His grandfather's journal. He recognized the handwriting from old farm records stored in the house. The same careful script, the same way of forming letters. But he'd never seen this book before, never known it existed. The leather was soft with age, the pages brittle. He opened it carefully, tilting it toward his flashlight. The first entry was dated March 17, 1943. Started the preservation efforts today. If this works, we'll save what matters most. If it doesn't, at least we tried. She says this is bigger than us, bigger than this town. She's probably right. She usually is. Preservation efforts. The words made no sense. What had there been to preserve in 1943? This was farm country, quiet and forgotten even during the war years. What had his grandfather been so afraid of losing? And who was she? The farmer spent 20 minutes trying to open that door, his frustration building with each failed attempt. The lock mechanism was unlike anything he'd seen. A series of rotating discs with numbers and symbols, some kind of combination lock that predated anything he recognized. His grandfather's journal offered no direct help, just cryptic references to the sequence and the pattern she taught us. He tried birthdays, anniversary dates, anything he could think of that might mean something to his grandfather. Nothing worked. Then he noticed it. Scratched faintly into the stone wall beside the door, barely visible in the flashlight beam, were numbers. Not random, but deliberate. 170943. March 17th, 1943. The date of the first journal entry. His hands shaking, the farmer turned the discs to match the sequence, his fingers clumsy with cold and anticipation. The sound of old gears engaging echoed through the tunnel like thunder. Mechanisms that hadn't moved in decades groaned to life. Metal sliding against metal, tumblers falling into place. The door shuddered, groaned, and slowly, incredibly slowly, began to swing inward on hinges that protested every millimeter of movement. The smell that rushed out nearly knocked him backward. Not decay, but preservation. Old paper? Fabric? The faint chemical scent of something used to protect against time itself. Mothballs. Wax. Something else he couldn't identify, but that reminded him of museums. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the chamber beyond, and what it revealed made him forget to breathe. The room was massive, at least 30 feet across, the ceiling carved from solid rock and reinforced with wooden beams that looked hand-hewn. And every inch of wall space was lined with wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling in careful rows, each one labeled with meticulous handwriting. Dates, names, numbers, a cataloging system that spoke of organization and purpose. The farmer stepped inside, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The air was dry, carefully controlled somehow, the temperature constant. Someone had engineered this space not just to exist, but to preserve. The nearest crate was labeled Morrison Family, 1943-1945. He lifted the lid carefully, hinges protesting after decades of stillness. Inside, wrapped in what looked like waxed cloth, were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Photographs in protective sleeves. A small wooden box containing a wedding ring, a lock of hair, a baby's first shoe, all arranged with care. Personal items, memories, lives preserved in careful detail. He moved to another crate. Johnson, 1944. More letters, more photographs. A military uniform, folded with precision. Dog tags on a chain that still gleamed despite the years. A diary written in a woman's hand, the first page reading, "If you're reading this, it means I never came home. Please tell my children I loved them. Tell them their mother died believing in something bigger than fear." The farmer's chest tightened. How many crates were there? He counted quickly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the chamber. At least 200, maybe more. Each one labeled with a family name. Each one sealed and protected. This wasn't a bomb shelter or a hiding place. This was an archive. A preservation chamber designed to outlast whatever catastrophe his grandfather had feared. But who were these families? And why had they entrusted their most precious possessions to be buried beneath his barn? More importantly, why had nobody ever mentioned this? Why had the entire county apparently kept this secret for over 70 years? He pulled out his grandfather's journal again, flipping through pages with new urgency. An entry from May 1943 caught his eye. 27 families now. Word is spreading quietly. They trust us because of her credentials, her teaching background. Nobody questions a school teacher asking to preserve history. She says we need to think bigger, plan for the worst. Says if the cities fall, rural communities will be all that's left. Our stories have to survive. A schoolteacher. The farmer's mind raced. His grandmother? He'd been told she'd gone away before he was born, that she'd died young and nobody liked to talk about it. Family shame, he'd always assumed. Something tragic that his grandfather had buried along with his grief. But what if that wasn't true? What if she'd been involved in this? Whatever this was. What if everything he'd been told about his family history was a lie? The farmer emerged from the barn 3 hours after he'd descended, his clothes covered in dust, his hands black with old grime that had settled into every crack and callus, and his mind spinning with questions that felt impossible to answer alone. The February sun was high now, making him squint as he stepped into the cold light. Everything looked different somehow, as if discovering what lay beneath had changed the very ground he stood on. The familiar fields, the weathered fence posts, the distant tree line, all of it felt like a stage set now, hiding something deeper and stranger than he'd ever imagined. He needed help. The realization came with a bitter taste. He'd spent years pushing people away, insisting he could handle everything himself. Pride had been his constant companion, his defense against a world that seemed determined to take everything from him. But this was beyond him. He needed someone who understood history, who knew the county's past, who might remember things he'd never been told. Someone who might have been alive when his grandfather had sealed that chamber. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwick lived 2 properties over, in a small house surrounded by gardens that even in winter looked carefully tended. She was 86 years old, a retired schoolteacher who'd taught at the county elementary school for 40 years before retiring in 1995. The farmer had always been polite to her, but distant, the way he was with everyone. She'd brought him casseroles after his wife left, had offered to help with harvest, had tried in a dozen small ways to be neighborly. He'd accepted nothing, returned nothing, kept his walls high. Now he stood on her porch, the letters from the chamber hidden in his jacket, and knocked. She answered wearing reading glasses and a cardigan, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent despite her age, took in his appearance with one quick glance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said simply, stepping aside. "Come in. You'll track dust everywhere, but I suspect you've got a reason." Her living room smelled like tea and old books, the comforting scent of a life spent with words and learning. Photographs covered every surface. Students in classroom settings, colleagues at retirement parties, moments from decades of teaching. The farmer sat on her couch, suddenly uncertain how to begin. How do you tell someone you've found a secret chamber filled with the preserved memories of hundreds of families? How do you explain that the ground beneath your farm apparently holds secrets that span generations? He started with the barn floor, the stairs, the tunnel. Mrs. Hartwick listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. She poured tea while he talked, her movements calm and precise, as if men showing up covered in dust and talking about hidden chambers was a perfectly normal occurrence. When he described the vault door and the crates, she set down her teacup with a soft click that seemed loud in the quiet room. "I wondered," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "if anyone would ever find it." The farmer's heart skipped. "You knew? Not about your families specifically, but I knew there were preservation chambers. My mother told me stories when I was young, before she passed in 1967. She said that during the war years, people were terrified, not just of losing the war, but of losing everything. Their history, their families, their very existence. Rural communities, especially immigrant communities, had already seen so much erased. Records destroyed, stories forgotten, languages lost. They were determined not to let it happen again. She stood, moving to a bookshelf with the careful steps of someone whose bones remembered being young, but whose body had to be reminded. She pulled down a worn photo album, its leather cover darkened with age and handling. My mother was part of it. Not a leader, but a participant. She helped families prepare their items, taught them how to preserve documents so they wouldn't decay. She was a librarian at the county library, back when we still had one. The farmer stared at her. But why? Why go to such lengths? And why keep it secret? Mrs. Hartwick opened the album, revealing photographs from the 1940s. Black and white images of serious-faced people standing in groups, holding boxes, gathered around what looked like community meetings. Because they'd seen what happened in Europe. Whole communities erased. Not just killed, but erased from history. Names forgotten. Stories lost. They were terrified it could happen here. And they weren't entirely wrong to be afraid. She pointed to one photograph. A woman in her 30s, dark hair pulled back, standing next to a tall man the farmer recognized instantly from old family photos. His grandfather, and the woman. She had his eyes, his nose, his daughter's smile. Is that? He couldn't finish the question. Your grandmother, Mrs. Hartwick confirmed. Sarah. She was the one who organized it all. The photograph trembled in the farmer's hands. His grandmother, Sarah, looked nothing like he'd imagined. Not weak, not fragile, not the tragic figure who'd gone away, as his father had always vaguely described her. She stood tall in the image, confident, her eyes sharp with intelligence. Next to her, his grandfather looked almost deferential, as if he understood that he was standing beside someone remarkable. I don't understand, the farmer said, his voice rough. I was told she died young, that she left before my father was even born, that she... He stopped, realizing how little he actually knew, how few details had ever been shared, how his family had always changed the subject when he asked. Mrs. Hartwick sat back down, folding her hands in her lap with the patience of someone who'd spent decades teaching complicated subjects to confused students. She didn't leave. Not the way you think. And she definitely didn't die young. Sarah lived until 1985. I was at her funeral, though it was small, private. Only a few people who knew what she'd really done. The farmer felt the world tilt. His grandmother had been alive until he was 23 years old, had been living somewhere, doing something, existing in the world while he'd grown up, believing she was long gone. Where? He managed to ask. Where was she? Traveling, organizing, building the network. Mrs. Hartwick pulled out another photograph, this one showing the same woman but older, maybe in her 50s, standing in front of what looked like a church basement. Your grandfather built the chamber. But Sarah, she made it part of something bigger. She understood that one cache of preserved memories wasn't enough. She spent the last 40 years of her life creating preservation sites across 5 states, teaching local people how to maintain them, how to keep the secrets, how to pass the knowledge down. The farmer's mind reeled. But why? Why leave her family? Why leave my father? Mrs. Hartwick's expression softened with something like pity, because she believed what she was doing mattered more, because she'd seen what happened when history was controlled by the powerful, when ordinary people's stories were deemed unimportant and lost. She thought she was saving something essential, and maybe she was, but she paid for it, certainly. Paid in ways I don't think she expected. She pulled out a letter, yellowed with age, and handed it to the farmer. She wrote this to my mother in 1962, read it. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the kind of script they didn't teach anymore. The farmer read slowly, his grandmother's voice coming alive on the page. I know what they say about me, that I abandoned my family, that I was selfish, cold. But how do I explain that I'm trying to save not just our family's story, but everyone's? How do I make them understand that in 50 years, 100 years, these preserved memories might be all that's left? I see my son sometimes from a distance. He's growing up strong. Maybe one day he'll understand. Maybe one day someone will find what we've built and realize it was worth it. The farmer's eyes burned. His father had died never understanding, had died believing his mother had simply left because she didn't love him enough to stay. And now, sitting in this quiet living room, he was learning that she'd been out there the whole time, building something she believed was more important than her own son's childhood. "There's more," Mrs. Hartwick said gently. "In your grandfather's chamber, there should be records, maps, documentation of the other sites." Sarah was meticulous. She believed in evidence, in paper trails, in making sure the knowledge would survive, even if the people didn't. "If you found the chamber, you'll find the rest." The farmer pulled out the letters he'd taken from the vault, spreading them on Mrs. Hartwick's coffee table. Her eyes widened as she saw the careful preservation, the labeling system, the organization. "This is exactly like her," she murmured, running a finger along one envelope. "Systematic, thorough, unwilling to leave anything to chance." "Help me," the farmer said suddenly, surprising himself. "Help me understand what this is, what they built, why it matters." Mrs. Hartwick smiled, and in that smile he saw echoes of his grandmother's expression in the photograph. Determined, intelligent, aware of the weight of history. "I'll do better than that," she said. "I'll help you find the rest of them. The other chambers, the rest of the network. Because if you found one, then the time has come for them all to be opened." Sarah always said someone would know when the moment was right. Maybe that someone is you. But was he ready? Could he handle what else might be hidden in those sealed chambers across 5 states? And what would happen when the rest of the world learned that ordinary people had been hiding history right beneath everyone's feet for over 70 years? The farmer didn't call his daughter. He sent a text, brief, cryptic. "Found something in the barn. Need to talk. Important." He didn't expect a response. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since the last argument about selling the farm, about his stubborn refusal to be reasonable and accept that keeping the land was a losing battle. But 3 hours later, her name appeared on his phone screen. "What did you find?" He stared at those 4 words for a long time before responding. How could he explain in a text message? He couldn't, so he sent, "Can't explain in writing. Can you come home?" The word home felt strange. It hadn't been her home in over a decade. She'd built a life in the city, had a career in corporate finance, wore expensive suits, and attended meetings in glass towers. Or at least, that's what he'd believed. He didn't know that she'd lost that job 8 months ago. Didn't know she'd been burning through savings while sending out resume after resume to positions that never responded. Didn't know she was 3 weeks away from having to give up her apartment. She arrived 2 days later, driving a car that looked less polished than he remembered, wearing jeans instead of business casual. When she stepped out, he saw the stress in the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders carried tension she was trying to hide. She was 37 now, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. "This better be good," she said, her tone defensive before he'd even spoken. "I had to cancel appointments to get here." Lie. He could hear it in her voice, though he said nothing. "It is," he responded simply. "Come see." He'd prepared the barn, brought down battery-powered lanterns, made the stairs as safe as possible. As they descended, he watched her face change, skepticism giving way to confusion, then to wonder, then to something like fear as the tunnel stretched ahead into darkness. "Dad," she whispered, and he couldn't remember the last time she'd called him that instead of using his first name. "What is this?" "Your great-grandfather's secret. Your great-grandmother's life work." He led her to the chamber, let her see the crates, the careful organization, the evidence of decades of preservation. He watched her open boxes with trembling hands, pulling out letters and photographs, reading words written by people who'd been dead for half a century. She found it before he did, the crate labeled with their family name. "Grandpa's crate," she breathed, lifting the lid. Inside were things he'd never seen. His grandfather's military commendations, hidden away. His grandmother's teaching certificates, letters between them that revealed a relationship far more complex than he'd imagined. Arguments about her work, his support mixed with resentment, her determination despite his doubts, and at the bottom, a letter addressed to whoever finds this. His daughter's hands shook as she opened it. His grandmother's handwriting filled the page. If you're reading this, then you know our secret. You know what we tried to do. I don't know if it was right. I don't know if leaving my family to build this network was worth it. But I still believe, that ordinary people's stories matter. That history shouldn't be written only by the powerful. If you judge me harshly, I understand. But please, protect what we built. Make it mean something. His daughter was crying, tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She left her family for this? She thought she was saving something important, the farmer said quietly. Mrs. Hartwick says there are more. Other chambers, a whole network. His daughter looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Genuine interest. The kind of engagement she'd lost somewhere in corporate boardrooms and performance reviews. How many? We don't know yet. Maybe 15. Maybe more. He paused. I need help with this. I can't do it alone. The admission hung between them. His acknowledgement of need, her opportunity to either reject him like he'd rejected so much of her help before, or to choose differently. She looked around the chamber, at the evidence of lives carefully preserved, at the possibility of something meaningful. I lost my job, she said suddenly. 8 months ago. I've been pretending everything is fine, but I'm broke. Almost broke. I came here hoping you'd found something valuable we could sell. The honesty was brutal, raw. I wasn't coming to help. I was coming to take. The farmer nodded slowly. I know the feeling. I've been 3 months behind on the mortgage. Bank's been sending letters I haven't opened. They looked at each other across the dimly lit chamber, two people drowning in their own pride, their own struggles, and for the first time in years they both laughed. Bitter, tired, but real. So we're both disasters, his daughter said. Seems like it runs in the family. He gestured at the chamber. But maybe we've got something here. Something that matters. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders. Tell me everything, and then let's figure out what the hell we're supposed to do with it. Mrs. Hartwick brought them names. Families who'd lived in the area during the 1940s, who might remember, who might have been part of the preservation project. Most were gone now, but their children remained, scattered across the county. The farmer's daughter took charge of the outreach with an efficiency that reminded him she'd once been very good at her job. She made calls, sent careful letters, asked questions without revealing too much. The first person who agreed to visit was Martha Chen, 74 years old, whose parents had immigrated from China in the 1930s. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February, her hands gripping an old photograph as if it were a lifeline. The farmer and his daughter led her down into the chamber, Mrs. Hartwick accompanying them with quiet support. Martha stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, her eyes scanning the crates. My mother talked about this place, she whispered. I thought she was confused. Old memories getting mixed up. But it's real. She moved toward a section of crates near the back, her steps quickening. Chen family. She said they'd saved our history, that someone was keeping it safe. I never believed. Her voice broke as she found it. Chen, 1943-1944. Inside the crate were immigration documents, carefully preserved. Her grandfather's papers, showing his arrival in San Francisco, his journey east, the racism he'd faced trying to buy farmland, letters written in Chinese, photographs of people Martha had only heard about in stories, a wedding dress her grandmother had sewn by hand, fabric still intact after 80 years, and at the bottom, a journal written in English by Martha's mother when she was just 16 years old. If the worst happens and they send us away like they sent the Japanese families, I want someone to know we existed, that we loved this land, that we belonged here too. Martha wept, the kind of deep sobs that come from grief and relief tangled together. Her family had lived in fear during those years, terror that they'd be next, that their existence would be erased, and someone, the farmer's grandmother, had promised to remember them, had kept that promise for decades. "There's more," the farmer's daughter said gently, showing Martha the careful cataloging system, the way each item had been preserved with archival materials, the evidence of expertise and care. "Sitatibin, your family's history was protected by people who understood what it meant to lose everything." Martha looked at them with eyes still wet with tears. Can I take these? My grandchildren should see them, should know where they came from." The farmer and his daughter exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't established rules or procedures. But looking at Martha's face, at her desperate need to connect with her past, the answer felt obvious. "Yes," the farmer said, "they're yours. They've always been yours. We were just keeping them safe." Word spread quickly after that. Martha told her cousin, who told their church community, who told friends across the county. Within 2 weeks, 5 more families had come forward, each with half-remembered stories about the preservation project. Each reunion brought the same tears, the same relief, the same gratitude. But it also brought questions. Legal questions. Who owned these items legally? What happened if families couldn't be found? And what about the items of historical significance? Documents that might belong in museums, artifacts that scholars should study. The farmer's daughter started researching property law, historical preservation regulations, archive management. She set up spreadsheets, tracking which families had been contacted, which items had been claimed, which mysteries remained unsolved. For the first time in months, she woke up with purpose, fell asleep planning the next day's work. And quietly, without discussing it, she moved back into her old bedroom in the farmhouse. Just temporarily, they both said. Just until they figured this out. But her boxes from the city started arriving, and neither of them mentioned her leaving. The farm began to change. People stopped by with food, offering help with spring planting. Elderly community members shared stories about the farmer's grandparents, filling in gaps he'd never known existed. The isolation he'd maintained for years was crumbling, replaced by something he'd forgotten could exist: connection. But then came the discovery that changed everything. While cataloging items in the southwest section of the chamber, his daughter found a metal box marked Network Maps, Confidential. Inside were hand-drawn maps showing locations across 5 states, each marked with coordinates and codes. 15 locations total, each one potentially holding more preserved histories. And attached to the maps was a letter written by his grandmother in 1978. To whoever finds this, the chambers were meant to be opened together when the time was right. They're connected not just in purpose, but in content. Each one holds pieces of a larger story. Find them all, and you'll understand what we were really preserving. What larger story? What had they been preserving beyond individual family histories? And why had these chambers needed to stay hidden for so long? The farmer's daughter decided to start with the closest location, a small town called Millbrook, 60 miles west, where the map indicated a preservation chamber beneath an old Methodist church. She drove there on a Wednesday, bringing copies of their documentation and a hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would remember. The church was abandoned now, scheduled for demolition in 3 months. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, the parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. She stood in front of it, feeling the weight of potential loss. If this building came down, whatever was beneath would be destroyed forever. She found the pastor of the new church building across town, Reverend Michael Torres, a man in his 50s who'd grown up in Millbrook but left for seminary and only recently returned. When she explained what she was looking for, his expression shifted from polite interest to something sharper, recognition mixed with concern. "The old church basement," he said slowly. "There were always rumors. My grandmother was the church secretary in the 1960s. She used to say there were parts of the basement that were off limits, sealed up after the war. But nobody talked about why." He agreed to meet her at the church the next morning with keys and flashlights. The farmer's daughter called her father, told him what she'd found, asked him to come. Something in her voice, a tremor of excitement mixed with unease, made him drop everything and drive. They met at the church at dawn. Reverend Torres had brought a crowbar and bolt cutters, anticipating that whatever seals had been put in place decades ago wouldn't open easily. The basement stairs were solid concrete, leading down into darkness that smelled of mold and standing water. The farmer's flashlight beams swept across the space. Old Sunday school rooms, a fellowship hall with folding tables still stacked against the walls, a kitchen with appliances from the 1950s, and in the furthest corner, behind a wall that looked newer than the rest, was a door sealed with padlocks that had rusted but still held firm. Reverend Torres cut through them, the metal protesting before finally giving way. The door swung open, and the smell that emerged was familiar now. Preservation chemicals, old paper, carefully controlled air. Another chamber, similar to the one beneath the barn but smaller. Maybe 100 crates instead of 200. But these crates were different. While the barn chamber had focused on family histories and personal items, these contained something else. Documents, official records, newspapers from the 1940s, carefully preserved. Government correspondence, meeting minutes from town councils, court records, the paper trail of an entire community, archived with the same meticulous care. The farmer's daughter opened one crate labeled Millbrook Town Records, 1942-1945, and found herself looking at documents that shouldn't have been hidden away. Building permits, land sales, tax records, all official, all legal, but preserved in secret rather than kept in the normal county archives. Why would someone hide public records? Reverend Torres asked, leafing through meeting minutes from the town council in 1943. The farmer found the answer in a different crate, one labeled simply, Evidence. Inside were letters from the town mayor to state officials, requesting permission to relocate Japanese-American families to work camps on local farms. Correspondence about seizing property from immigrants who couldn't prove citizenship. Notes about planning to redraw district lines to dilute minority voting power. Evidence of discrimination. Evidence of plans that might have been illegal even then, but which had been carried out quietly, hidden in bureaucratic language and official-looking paperwork. Someone had collected all of it, preserved it, and buried it beneath a church, as if waiting for the day when the truth could finally be told. Had my grandmother, Reverend Torres breathed, holding a letter signed by the church pastor from 1943. She must have been part of this. She must have helped hide these records. The farmer's daughter was photographing everything, her hands steady despite the implications sinking in. This wasn't just about preserving family memories. This was about documenting injustice, about making sure there was evidence that couldn't be destroyed or rewritten. His grandmother hadn't just been saving history, she'd been collecting proof. But proof of what exactly? And who had she been protecting it from? They found the answer in the last crate they opened. Inside were newspaper clippings from various sources, some local, some national, all from the late 1930s and 1940s. Articles about book burnings in Germany, stories about Japanese internment camps, editorials warning about government overreach, and handwritten notes in his grandmother's distinctive script. This can happen anywhere, is happening here. We must remember. We must have proof. The farmer felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandmother had been afraid, not of foreign enemies, but of what her own country might do, of what her own neighbors might forget or choose to ignore. She'd been documenting the quiet injustices, the small cruelties, the bureaucratic violence that happened in towns like this one, far from headlines and attention, and she'd hidden it all, waiting for a time when it would be safe to reveal. There are more chambers, the farmer's daughter said quietly, looking at the maps she'd brought. 13 more sites. What if they all contain records like this? Reverend Torres set down the documents he'd been reading, his face pale. Then this isn't just a preservation project. This is evidence of a coordinated, Effort to document civil rights violations across multiple states, hidden for decades. He paused. And if powerful people were involved in those violations, they're not going to be happy about this coming to light. The farmer never expected the woman in the expensive car. She arrived on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after they'd opened the Millbrook Chamber, driving a black sedan that looked too polished for their gravel driveway. She introduced herself as Constance Whitmore, president of the County Historical Society, and her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, I understand you've made quite a discovery," she said, standing in his living room without waiting to be invited, her eyes scanning the old farmhouse with poorly concealed judgment. "I'm here to offer the Historical Society's expertise in cataloging and preserving your find. We have professionals, climate-controlled facilities, connections to major universities." The farmer's daughter, who'd been working at the kitchen table, stood up slowly. She'd spent enough years in corporate boardrooms to recognize a power play when she saw one. "That's generous," she said carefully. "We appreciate the offer. We'll definitely consider it." Constance's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold. "I'm afraid I wasn't clear. The county has regulations about historical artifacts discovered on private property, particularly items of significant cultural value. The Historical Society has jurisdiction over such finds." "Actually," the farmer's daughter replied, her voice pleasant but firm, "I've researched the relevant statutes quite thoroughly. Items found on private property remain the property of the landowner unless they meet very specific criteria for state or federal historical significance. Family documents and personal belongings don't qualify." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Constance set her purse down on the coffee table with deliberate care. "I see. Well, perhaps I should be more direct. I have contacts in the state government, in the Preservation Bureau. One phone call, and I can have this property investigated for potential violations of historical preservation laws. That could be very expensive for you, time-consuming, and the publicity might attract attention from families who might sue for the return of items they claim belong to them." It was a threat, barely disguised. The farmer felt anger rise in his chest, the old stubborn pride that had isolated him for years flaring back to life. "So, you need to leave," he said, his voice low and dangerous. But his daughter put a hand on his arm. "Mr. Whitmore? Sorry, Ms. Whitmore. Can I ask you something? What's your real interest here?" Because the Historical Society is a volunteer organization with an annual budget of maybe $15,000, you don't have climate-controlled facilities. You don't have professional archivists. So what do you actually want? Constance's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly beneath. "There are items in that chamber of significant monetary value. Rare documents, artifacts that could be sold or loaned to major institutions. The Historical Society deserves to benefit from discoveries made in our county." "You mean you deserve to benefit?" the farmer's daughter corrected. "You want to use our discovery to elevate your position, make connections, maybe even make money." The silence stretched. Then Constance picked up her purse and walked toward the door. "You're making a mistake. I tried to be reasonable. But if you want to do this the hard way, we certainly can. Expect to hear from state officials within the week." She left, her sedan kicking up dust as she drove away too fast. The farmer and his daughter stood at the window, watching her go. "She'll follow through," his daughter said quietly. "She'll cause problems." "Let her try." The farmer's voice was steady, but inside he felt the familiar fear of bureaucracy, of regulations he didn't understand, of people with power and connections who could take everything from him. That night, his daughter started making calls. To lawyers, to property rights advocates, to historical preservation experts. She was looking for allies, for people who understood what they'd found and why it mattered. What she found instead was a woman named Dr. Patricia Mendez, a lawyer who specialized in indigenous repatriation and historical property rights. Dr. Mendez drove up from the state capitol the next day, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who listened to their story with increasing interest. When they showed her the chambers, the documents, the evidence his grandmother had collected, she was quiet for a long time. "This is extraordinary," she finally said. "Not just the preservation, but the documentation of injustice. This could rewrite local histories, challenge official narratives, provide evidence for descendants seeking recognition or reparations." "Can we protect it?" the farmer asked. "Keep it from being taken?" Dr. Mendez smiled. "Not only can we protect it, we can use it. I'll work pro bono if you'll agree to establish a proper foundation, make this accessible to researchers and families who need it. As for Ms. Whitmore's threats, there's actually precedent for this. Your grandfather filed proper documentation for the chamber in 1946. I found the records." The farmer stared at her. "That's impossible. We checked with the county. There's nothing." "Because there was a courthouse fire in 1974 that destroyed a lot of records. But I found backup documentation in state archives, microfilm that nobody bothered to look at. Your grandfather was meticulous. He registered this as a private family archive, which gives you very specific legal protections." For the first time in weeks, the farmer felt hope. But Dr. Mendez's next words tempered it. "However, we need to move carefully. If there are other chambers with similar records, and if those records document the actions of families who still have power in this region, they're not going to want this information public. Constance Whitmore might just be the first of many problems you'll face." They found the second chamber by accident. The farmer's daughter had been cross-referencing the coordinates from her grandmother's maps with current property records, trying to figure out who owned the land where the preservation sites supposedly existed. One location kept appearing under the name of a family trust, the Morrison Trust, established in 1952, managing property that included an old schoolhouse in a town called Riverside, 70 miles north. She called the trust's contact number, expecting a lawyer or property manager. Instead, an elderly man answered, his voice rough with age but sharp with curiosity. "You're asking about the old school? Why?" She explained carefully, mentioning the preservation chamber beneath her family's barn, the documents they'd found, the evidence that there might be similar sites. The silence on the other end stretched so long she thought he'd hung up. Then, "My grandmother said someone would come eventually. She made me promise to wait, to protect the site until the right person asked the right questions. Can you come tomorrow?" His name was Thomas Morrison, 89 years old, the last surviving grandchild of the family who'd built the schoolhouse in 1890. He met them at the property, a two-story brick building that had been converted into a community center in the 1960s, but was now mostly empty, used occasionally for local events. The basement was always off-limits, Thomas explained as they descended worn stairs. "My grandmother said there were structural issues, that it wasn't safe. But I knew. She told me when I turned 18, made me swear to keep the secret." The chamber beneath the schoolhouse was the largest they'd seen yet. Not just crates, but filing cabinets, shelf units, an entire archive system that spoke of decades of careful collection. Thomas had a key, an actual key, not a combination. And the door opened smoothly, revealing a space that was still dust-free, still carefully maintained. "I've been coming down here once a month for 60 years, Thomas said quietly, checking the seals, replacing the desiccant packets, making sure nothing deteriorated. My grandmother taught me how, said it was the most important thing I'd ever do." The crates here were different again. These contained not just local records, but regional documentation. Birth certificates for families who'd never received official ones. Marriage records for couples whose unions weren't recognized by the state. Property deeds for land that had been stolen or seized. Evidence of redlining, of discriminatory lending, of systematic exclusion from opportunities. And at the center of the archive was a metal filing cabinet labeled Network Coordination. Inside were letters between the various chamber caretakers, written in code but carefully preserved. His grandmother's handwriting appeared in dozens of them, coordinating efforts, sharing techniques, planning for the future. The farmer's daughter pulled out a letter dated 1978, one of the last before his grandmother died. It was addressed to all the chamber caretakers. The time will come when this can be revealed. When society is ready to face what we've documented, you'll know the moment when someone comes asking the right questions. Trust your instinct. The truth is always worth preserving, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. Thomas pointed to another section of the archive. There's something else. Something my grandmother said was the most important part. He pulled out a map, larger and more detailed than the ones they'd found before. It showed all 15 chamber locations, but it also showed something more, connecting lines between them, routes that linked the sites in a specific pattern. It's not just random locations, the farmer's daughter breathed, studying the map. It's a network. They could move information between sites, coordinate efforts, share resources. My grandmother said they were preparing for the worst, Thomas explained, that if one site was discovered or destroyed, the others could preserve the information. Redundancy. Multiple backups of the most critical documents. They were thinking like archivists, like people who understood that information could be lost if you weren't careful. Dr. Mendez, who'd accompanied them, was photographing everything with steady hands. This is unprecedented. A grassroots archival network, operated mostly by women, preserving evidence of civil rights violations across 5 states for over 70 years. This could change how we understand this period of history. But the farmer's daughter had found something else. A list of names attached to the coordination files. Families who'd been involved in the violations documented in the chambers. And some of those names were familiar. Very familiar. County supervisors, former mayors, business owners whose descendants still ran major companies in the region. If we reveal this, she said slowly, we're not just opening archives. We're accusing powerful families of historical wrongdoing. Some of them are still alive, still influential. Thomas nodded grimly. My grandmother knew that. Said that's why it had to stay hidden until enough time had passed. Until enough people involved were dead. Until the truth couldn't destroy living people, only reputations. But how do we know when that time is? The farmer asked. Dr. Mendez looked up from her photographs. I think that time is now. The people who did these things are mostly gone. Their children might face uncomfortable truths about their parents, but that's different from facing criminal charges. And the families who were harmed, they deserve to know. They deserve their history. The farmer felt the weight of his grandmother's legacy settling on his shoulders. She'd spent decades building this network, protecting these secrets, waiting for someone to find them and know what to do. And somehow, impossibly, that someone was him and his daughter. 2 people who'd spent years isolated from each other, both drowning in their own failures, now standing in a hidden archive that could rewrite history. We need to find the rest, his daughter said with certainty. All 15 chambers. We need to see the full scope of what they documented, and then we decide how to reveal it. But time was running out. Constance Whitmore's threats were real, and they'd soon learn just how far powerful people would go to keep the past buried. The call came on a Tuesday evening. A number the farmer didn't recognize, a voice he'd never heard before. Smooth, professional. The kind of voice that came from decades of business negotiations. The man introduced himself as Richard Pemberton, attorney for the Pemberton Family Trust. I understand you've made some discoveries on your property, he said. I'd like to discuss a business proposition. The farmer put him on speaker so his daughter could hear. What kind of proposition? The Pemberton family has deep roots in this region. My great-grandfather was a businessman here in the 1940s, very successful, built the foundation for our family's current holdings. We're very interested in preserving local history, and we'd like to offer to purchase your farm at a very generous price, significantly above market value. The farmer's daughter leaned forward. Why? A pause. We believe your property has historical significance. We'd like to establish a museum, properly curate the items you've found, Make them accessible to the public in a controlled manner. How much? The farmer asked, though he already knew this wasn't really about money. $2 million. Cash. You could pay off all your debts, have enough left over to retire comfortably. Your daughter could return to her career without financial worries. All we ask is that you sell us the property and everything on it, including full rights to the contents of the preservation chamber. $2 million. The farmer felt the number like a physical weight. It would solve everything, every problem, every debt, every sleepless night worrying about the bank foreclosing. He could hear his daughter's breath catch. She knew as well as he did what that money would mean for both of them. "I'll need to think about it," the farmer said carefully. "Of course, but I should mention that time is somewhat of the essence. There are some legal complications developing. I understand the Historical Society has filed a complaint with state preservation authorities. That could become expensive to fight. Our offer would include taking care of all legal matters, making any complications disappear." After he hung up, the farmer and his daughter sat in silence. Dr. Mendez, who'd been staying in their guest room while helping document the chambers, came down the stairs with a laptop, her expression grim. "I found him. Richard Pemberton. His great-grandfather was Robert Pemberton, owner of Pemberton Manufacturing. I found his name in the Millbrook Chamber documents. He was the primary employer in that town during the 1940s, and he systematically underpaid immigrant workers while overcharging them for company housing. Trapped them in debt they could never escape." She turned the laptop so they could see scanned documents, payroll records, housing contracts, letters from workers begging for fair treatment. "Your grandmother documented all of it. And if we reveal these records, the Pemberton family's entire legacy as pillars of the community gets rewritten. They become exploiters, profiteers who built their wealth on the backs of vulnerable people." "So the offer isn't about preserving history," the farmer's daughter said flatly. "It's about burying it again." "Almost certainly," Dr. Mendez confirmed. "They want to control the narrative, buy the property, cherry-pick what gets revealed, destroy or hide the rest. They can claim they're honoring history while actually protecting their reputation." The farmer thought about $2 million, about finally being free of debt, free of the constant grinding worry that had defined the last decade of his life, about his daughter getting her life back. All it would cost was the truth. "No," he said quietly. His daughter looked at him, surprise clear on her face. "Dad, I know what it is. But your great-grandmother spent 40 years building this network. She gave up her family for it. I can't sell that for money, even that much money." He met his daughter's eyes. "Can you?" She was quiet for a long moment. The old her, the corporate version, the one who'd spent years chasing success and financial security, would have said yes, would have argued for the practical choice, the smart choice. But something had changed in the weeks since they'd opened that first chamber. She'd found purpose in preserving these stories, meaning in the work that had nothing to do with profit. "No," she finally said. "I can't either." Dr. Mendez smiled with something like pride. "Then we need to move fast. The Pembertons won't take rejection well, and if they were willing to offer $2 million, they'll be willing to spend money to stop you other ways." That night, the farmer couldn't sleep. He walked out to the barn, descended into the chamber that had started everything. The crates sat in their careful rows, each one holding someone's history, someone's truth. His grandmother had believed this was worth sacrificing for. Was he strong enough to do the same? He found a letter he hadn't noticed before, tucked into a crate labeled personal. It was addressed to him, or rather, to whoever inherits this burden. His grandmother's handwriting filled the page. "I know the cost of what I'm asking. I know choosing truth over comfort is the hardest thing you can do. But some things matter more than our individual happiness. Some truths have to be told, even when telling them hurts. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to help you, but I trust that if you found this, you're the right person to finish what we started." The farmer folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he climbed back up to the farmhouse, where his daughter was still awake, working on documentation strategies with Dr. Mendez. He sat down at the table with them. "All right," he said, "let's figure out how to reveal all of this without getting destroyed in the process." They saved the hardest location for last. The map showed it clearly: a chamber beneath a condemned library in a town called Ashford, population 3,200, 50 miles south. The building was scheduled for demolition in 2 weeks, already surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs. If they didn't get in soon, whatever was beneath would be destroyed forever. The problem was that Ashford was the Pemberton family's stronghold. They owned half the businesses in town, funded the local hospital, had a wing of the community college named after them. Going there felt like walking into enemy territory. They went anyway. The farmer, his daughter, Dr. Mendez, and Thomas Morrison, who'd insisted on coming along. "I promised my grandmother I'd see this through," he said simply. The library was a beautiful building, early 1900s architecture with stone columns and arched windows, but decades of neglect had left it crumbling. The roof had partially collapsed, water damage had destroyed the main reading room, and the town council had voted 5-2 to tear it down, rather than pay for restoration. They entered through a side door that Thomas jimmied open with practiced ease. "Not my first time sneaking into an old building," he admitted with a slight smile. The basement stairs were treacherous, some steps completely rotted through. They descended carefully, flashlights cutting, through dust-thick air, and there, behind a false wall in what had once been the library's boiler room, was the final chamber door. This one opened with the same date combination that had worked on the barn chamber, 170943. The door swung inward, and they stepped into something different from all the others. This wasn't just an archive. This was the central hub, the coordination center for the entire network. The walls were covered with maps, charts, timelines. Filing cabinets lined every surface, each one meticulously labeled. And in the center of the room, on a large table, were journals. Dozens of them, all in his grandmother's handwriting, documenting 40 years of work. The farmer's daughter opened one at random, reading aloud, "June 1967. The Millbrook Chamber reported water damage in the eastern section. Sent Thompson to help with repairs. We can't lose these records. Future generations need to know what happened here, how discrimination was woven into the very fabric of these communities. It wasn't just the South. It wasn't just obvious violence. It was quiet, bureaucratic, legal, and it's still happening." They spent hours in that chamber, reading, documenting, understanding. His grandmother hadn't just preserved history. She'd analyzed it, connected patterns across different communities, shown how the same discriminatory practices appeared in different forms across 5 states. And she'd kept personal journals, too, ones that revealed her doubts, her loneliness, her regrets. Entry from 1973. "I saw my son from a distance today. He's 50 now, has a family of his own, children who will never know me. Was it worth it? I tell myself yes. I tell myself that this work matters more than one woman's happiness. But late at night, when I'm alone in another cheap hotel room, I'm not sure I believe it." The farmer felt tears he couldn't stop. His grandmother had been human, had suffered, had questioned her choices just like he questioned his. She hadn't been a saint or a hero, just a person who'd decided something mattered enough to sacrifice for, then lived with the consequences. The final section of the chamber contained the most sensitive materials, evidence not just of discrimination, but of corruption. Documented bribes, payoffs, illegal land seizures, names and dates and proof. The Pemberton family was heavily featured, but they weren't alone. Dozens of prominent families across all 5 states were implicated in systematic exploitation of vulnerable communities. "This is explosive," Dr. Mendez breathed, photographing documents as fast as she could. "This could trigger investigations, lawsuits, demands for reparations. This is—" The sound of the door slamming shut made them all freeze. They heard footsteps in the basement above, multiple people moving with purpose. The farmer moved to the chamber door, tried to push it open. It didn't budge. Someone had locked it from the outside. A voice came through the metal door, muffled but clear enough. "Richard Pemberton. I'm sorry it came to this. I really am. But you were warned. This history needs to stay buried. For everyone's good. You can't just leave us here," the farmer's daughter shouted. "The building's being demolished tomorrow morning instead of next week. Expedited the permit. By the time anyone realizes you're missing, this entire structure will be rubble. No one will ever find this chamber. Or you." His footsteps receded. They heard the basement door slam, then silence. The farmer looked at the metal door, the stone walls, the chamber that his grandmother had built to preserve history, and realized it might become their tomb. Panic would have been easy. The chamber was solid stone and metal, designed to be impenetrable. They had their phones, but this far underground, there was no signal. The air was limited, filtered through vents that wouldn't sustain 4 people for more than maybe 12 hours. And in the morning, a demolition crew would start bringing down the building above them. But the farmer's daughter wasn't panicking. She was thinking, her corporate crisis management training finally useful in a situation that actually mattered. There has to be another way out. My great-grandmother was too smart to build a trap with only one exit. Thomas Morrison was already moving, examining walls with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades maintaining hidden chambers. She was also paranoid about being caught. "Every chamber I've seen had emergency exits, escape routes. We just have to find it." They split up, each taking a wall, running their hands over stone, looking for irregularities, hidden seams, anything that might indicate a passage. The farmer worked the north wall, his fingers finding carved symbols he'd overlooked before, numbers arranged in patterns, dates. "Here!" Dr. Mendez called from the eastern corner. "The stones are different here, newer, or arranged differently." They gathered around as she pressed against a particular block. Nothing happened. She tried another. Still nothing. The farmer looked at the symbols he'd found, realized they were dates, the founding dates of each chamber. He called them out in chronological order, and Dr. Mendez pressed stones in that sequence. On the 15th press, a section of wall ground slowly opened, revealing a tunnel that hadn't been opened in decades. "She built a network underground, too," Thomas whispered, awed. "Not just archives, but actual passages between some of the sites." The tunnel was narrow, rough-hewn, terrifying. But it was a way out. They gathered what they could carry, the most important journals, key documents, evidence they couldn't lose. Then they entered the passage, pulling the stone door closed behind them. The tunnel stretched for what felt like miles, but was probably only half that, heading away from the library at a steady decline. Their flashlights showed marks on the walls, his grandmother's handwriting, giving directions, marking distances, offering encouragement to anyone who might need to use this escape route. They emerged an hour later in another basement, this one belonging to what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse. They climbed out into early morning light, exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but alive, and carrying evidence that could change everything. The farmer pulled out his phone, signal restored, and made a call. Not to police, not yet. To every contact his daughter had gathered, every journalist who'd expressed interest in their story, every academic who studied historical preservation and civil rights. He spoke clearly, concisely, telling them where to meet, what to bring, how to document what they were about to reveal. Then he called the Pemberton family attorney. "We're alive, and in 2 hours, we're holding a press conference. Everything we found is going public. All of it. You tried to bury the truth, but the truth doesn't stay buried." Richard Pemberton's voice was tight with fury. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Maybe," the farmer agreed. "But it's our mistake to make. Just like it was my grandmother's choice to preserve all this. Just like it's our choice now to reveal it." They held the press conference in the barn, right above the original chamber. Journalists crowded into the space, cameras recording as Dr. Mendez presented their findings. The network of chambers. The documented evidence of discrimination, corruption, and exploitation. The names of families who'd built their fortunes on systematic injustice. The farmer's daughter showed photographs of preserved documents, explained the archival techniques, described the decades of work that had gone into protecting this history. Thomas Morrison spoke about his grandmother's dedication, about the promise he'd kept for 60 years. And the farmer read from his grandmother's final journal entry, written just weeks before she died. The truth is coming. I can feel it. Not in my lifetime, but soon. Someone will find what we built. Someone will have the courage to reveal it. And when they do, all this sacrifice will have meant something. All the loneliness, all the years away from family, all the quiet, careful work. It will matter. Because the truth always matters, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. The response was immediate and overwhelming. National news picked up the story. Historians called demanding access. Descendants of families whose histories had been preserved began reaching out, seeking their records. And yes, some powerful families threatened lawsuits, denial, attacked their credibility. But the evidence was undeniable. The documents were real. The network was real. The truth, buried for 70 years, was finally coming to light. 6 months later, the farm looked completely different. The barn had been reinforced and expanded, converted into a proper archive center with climate control and security systems. The original chamber remained intact, preserved as it had been found, but now accessible through a proper entrance with safety features and accessibility accommodations. The farmer's daughter had become the director of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, named after the grandmother she'd never known. The foundation managed all 15 chambers, working with local communities to preserve the sites and make the records accessible. She'd found her calling, purpose that corporate life had never provided, and she'd never been happier despite the modest salary. Thomas Morrison had become the foundation's primary consultant, his 60 years of experience maintaining the chambers invaluable. Other caretakers had emerged too, descendants of the original network, people who'd kept quiet promises for decades, now finally able to share what they'd protected. Dr. Mendez had become their legal counsel, fighting off challenges from families who wanted the records destroyed or hidden. Some lawsuits were still pending. Some families had publicly apologized for their ancestors' actions. Others remained defiant. But the truth was out now, documented and preserved beyond their ability to suppress it. Mrs. Hartwick visited often, helping identify families in photographs, sharing stories her mother had told her. She'd become friends with the farmer, the kind of friendship he'd denied himself for too many years. The farm was no longer isolated. It had become a gathering place, a center for community healing and historical reckoning. The farmer himself had transformed. The weight of debt was gone. Donations to the foundation had included enough to pay off the mortgage, maintain the farm, fund the archive. But more than that, the weight of isolation had lifted. He'd learned to accept help, to ask for it, to be part of something larger than his own stubborn pride. Families continued to come, seeking records their ancestors had entrusted to the network. Each reunion brought tears, healing, connection to a past that had almost been lost. The farmer watched them, understanding finally what his grandmother had been trying to save. Not just documents, but identity itself. The right of ordinary people to have their stories remembered and valued. One particular reunion stayed with him. A Japanese-American family whose grandparents had been interred during the war found documents showing that his grandmother had protected their property records when local officials tried to seize their farm. Those records had enabled the family to reclaim land that legally belonged to them, land they'd believed was lost forever. The granddaughter, now in her 60s, stood in the archive center with tears streaming down her face. "Your grandmother saved our family's future," she said. "We would have had nothing without these records. Nothing." The farmer thought about sacrifice and choice, about what matters enough to give up everything else. His grandmother had made her decision and lived with its costs. He and his daughter had made theirs, turning down money that could have solved all their problems because some things mattered more than financial security. The farm would never be what it was, a quiet, isolated place where a stubborn man worked alone. It was something better now, something his grandmother would have recognized as worthy of her sacrifice, a place where truth was preserved, where history was honored, where ordinary people's stories were treated as valuable as any king's. On the anniversary of finding the chamber, the farmer stood at the tunnel entrance with his daughter beside him. They'd invited press, historians, descendants of the network builders. But before the ceremony began, they had a private moment, just the two of them in the space his grandmother had created. "Do you think she'd be proud?" his daughter asked quietly. The farmer thought about Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd left her family, who'd spent 40 years in lonely dedication to an ideal, who'd died hoping someone would finish what she started. He thought about the network she'd built, the histories she'd saved, the truth she'd preserved against all odds. "I think she knew," he said finally. "I think she knew that eventually someone would find this and understand why it mattered. She built it to last long enough for the right people to discover it. And somehow, impossibly, we were those people." They stood together in silence, surrounded by shelves of preserved histories, the evidence of his grandmother's extraordinary life. The truth had been buried for 70 years, but it had survived, and now, finally, it could be told. The farmer had spent his life feeling inadequate, measuring himself against a family legacy he'd never understood. But standing here now, he realized he'd become part of that legacy in ways he never expected. Not by being perfect, not by having all the answers, but by choosing truth over comfort, connection over isolation, purpose over profit. His grandmother's final words echoed in his mind. "The truth is always worth preserving, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful." He understood now, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure the truth was never buried again. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one.